Hi, this is Jeff Ryan. Welcome to this week's edition of Tales from the Cabin, where I tell stories that are almost too unbelievable to be true, but really are. This week I want to tell you the story about how I came to write a book that's become very popular, and it's just a great story. I'm so glad that I had the chance to tell this tale. And it fell into my lap in what I still believe to be an incredible way. So, brief background. I was working as a marketing professional in Portland, Maine, and I'd been at the marketing gig for quite a while, and one day I just had this epiphany that I've been writing other people's stories my entire professional life, and wouldn't it be cool to start telling some of my own, or at least writing books that I want to write. So I had recently finished hiking the Appalachian Trail over a 28-year period with the same friend. Naturally, over the last few years I'd been doing that, I'd been thinking about writing a book about it. So I started, and I would spend evenings writing this book in the office that I had in an office building in a busy part of Portland on the waterfront. But after people went home, it got relatively quiet. So I'd been toiling away at a book which would become my first book, Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's trail. And I was working in there one Wednesday night, and I heard the elevator doors open around 10 p.m. And this guy walked in with a vacuum cleaner. It was his weekly time to clean up the office. And he had cut off shorts, jean shorts, and a t-shirt on, and had his trusty vacuum cleaner with him. And we got chatting. He said, what are you doing in here this late at night? And I said, well, I'm writing a book about the Appalachian Trail. And he sort of took a step back and he said, really? That's unbelievable. I have something for you. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, are you going to be here next Wednesday? And I said, well, I am now. And he said, great, I'll meet you here at the same time. So the following week I was in writing the book again, and in he comes and he says, here's what I have for you. And it was this book. And it was a 1934 edition of the Appalachian Trail Guide to Maine, one of the first editions of the description of the trail. If that weren't cool enough, it was written by one of the guys, in fact, the guy most responsible for building the trail, a guy named Myron Avery, who grew up in Lubec, Maine, and had taken on the task of building the trail. And so he hands me this book and he leaves, and I start thumbing through the book. And it's got trail descriptions and some maps in the back, early Appalachian Trail maps. And I'm thumbing through the beginning of it, a description of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. And there are 3 paragraphs on page 43 that really got my enthusiasm and inquisitiveness going. It says, Jim Whyte Lookout, Whyte, W-H-Y-T-E. Jim Whyte's Lookout is located on a Blue Blaze side trail between Thompson Brook and Little Wilson Stream in the Bodfish Farm/Monson section of the Appalachian Trail. The lookout, and then in parentheses it says cabin, is on an open knoll commanding a widespread view. Legend has spun many stories around this picturesque character. Adventurer, soldier of fortune, apparently at home in every corner of Maine, this man with his lookout cabin lacked an apparent means of livelihood and was a mystery to the natives of this region. A complete account appears in The Mystery of Jim Whyte and His Woodland Lookout by Roland J. Sawyer, Jr., The Boston Herald, January 7, 1934. The author vouches for the authenticity of the statements, concerning Whyte's lurid career. Well, I was busy writing that first book, and so I was loath to look that up right away. But the seed was planted, and I always thought I wanted to return and see what that story of this character, Jim Whyte, was all about. Fast forward a couple years, Appalachian Odyssey is out. I'm deeply into writing my second book called Blazing Ahead, which is about the history of the trail and how it was built. And I kept circling back to that idea of this Jim Whyte character. But the time came and I started researching this guy, Jim Whyte. So first I looked for that article from the Boston Herald, and there was no way I could find that thing. I spent a couple weeks looking for it. So I contacted a friend, a historian friend, and she turned me on to a link at the Library of Congress. And I wrote to this person, the email link, figuring I'd never get a response, or if I did, it would be quite a while. Lo and behold, about 15 minutes went by, and the fellow who answered the email went through their digital archives and found the article about Jim Whyte. And it was true. He was a world traveler, and he ended up showing up in this town of Monson, Maine. I needed to learn more, so I contacted the Monson Historical Society, something I probably should have done first, but now that this article had really given me something to go with, I contacted the Monson Historical Society, and a fellow named Glenn Poole said, yeah, we've got a big file on Jim Whyte, come on up. So that's what led me to ultimately write this book called Hermit. The more I learned about Jim Whyte, the more phenomenal the story became, and the more I could not believe what this guy had accomplished in his life. He showed up in Monson, Maine in 1895 and asked locals where the best deer hunting was. He was a complete stranger to them. They told him where a couple good spots were. I would imagine that they wouldn't tell him what the best spots were, who would? But he disappeared after hunting season. They thought never to be seen again. In fact, where he went was Idaho to go panning for silver. When he showed up a few years later, he had a deed for 30 acres of land high on a mountain right outside of town, and had a cabin up there where he also, when he had showed up with a woman that he said was his wife, Dora. They stayed there for a year. She disappeared the next spring on one of the early spring trains south, said that the Maine winters had done her in. And a few weeks later, Jim Whyte shows up with another woman in town, shows up with this woman who he introduces as Tessa. And Tessa was from a nearby town, Dover Foxcroft, and she stayed for 20 years. So as the stories of Jim Whyte continued to sort of spill out over the years, what was learned about him was he knew 6 languages fluently. He was independently wealthy. No one really knew where the money had come from in the first place. But they speculated about that. And he was, as I said, well-to-do, but something happened to his fortune. It was really obvious. After a few years, he stopped wearing brand new clothes, started putting patches in his clothes, started pawning off some of his most valuable things, or some of his valuable things, I should say, and earning money to get by. 20 years into it, Tessa disappeared. She went back to her hometown, and Jim Whyte was left alone up there, sort of scraping pennies to get by. And then suddenly he got back into the money again. So the rumors started flying again. How did he get back into the money? his mother was still alive, and he would go down and visit her in New York from time to time, New York City. He'd take the train down and let people know that he was visiting his mom, but then he would come back again and spend his time, and he had gotten to know a few of the locals, and they speculated about where his money was coming from. Fast forward to the 1930s. So Jim Whyte had been in the Monson area for over 3 decades, and he started showing signs of dementia. And he told the locals that there was a home for Freemasons that were aged, and it was in Burlington, New Jersey. And oh, by the way, one of the things he shared for the first time was that he was a Freemason. So he asked to be put on a train and sent down to this home for the aged in Burlington, New Jersey. One of his friends from Monson ended up going down there and visiting him, and it was very shortly before his death. And he had had a series of strokes by then, Jim Whyte, and he had lost capacity on one side of his body, and his voice was, his ability to communicate was pretty much gone. However, he did trace the number 40,000, wrote it on a velour bedspread with his finger, and pointed at the ground and said to his friend, "Do you know what I'm saying?" Basically, I buried this money near my cabin. And so this fellow got back to Monson, and the rumor got out, and it set everyone digging around his cabin. The money was never found, at least so we think. And so 40,000 of gold left in the ground, a mystery of how he made all his money 2 times, made the money, lost it, made it back again, and various little snippets in newspaper articles and local stories. So I started digging, and when I was writing about Jim Whyte's cabin being built, I made up the fact that they had put dowels down through the logs to give the structure more cohesiveness or strength in wind. This was a structural technique that was rarely, if ever, seen in Maine. It was in doing research into log cabins over the years, even before I wrote this book, I found out that this technique was more popular in Finland and Sweden and parts of Quebec, where windswept regions were basically wide open, and it was used to make sure that the cabin walls had strength for high winds. Why I added that as a detail, I don't really know. But anyway, be that as it may, I decided to add that as a detail to Jim Whyte's cabin, that it was built that way. And when I was researching the book, I met the grandson of the guy who had purchased the property from Jim Whyte's estate after he died. It had been several years before the property went up for sale. So I asked him about the cabin, and he said that it was in such disrepair that when they first showed up, they realized they'd have to tear it down. And so I asked him about that, and he said, man, it was a bitch and a half to tear that thing down, because I'd never seen this before, that they had put dowels down through the walls to give it extra strength. And I couldn't believe it. You know, why did I put that detail in? Who knew? There were a couple other incidents like that just seemed to fall into my head, show up in my head, show up on the page, as it were. One of the characters I invented took part in a real-life tragedy that took place up there. And it was the Ottawa train wreck. And it was a train wreck that involved a head-on collision between a passenger train and a freight train. Both passenger and freight trains were very frequent through Monson in that era. In fact, there were 42 trains per day going through town, either carrying freight mostly lumber and slate mined from the Monson area. And passenger trains came largely from the Canadian Maritimes and went to Montreal and back, carrying steamship passengers from Europe to and from Montreal. And so the frequency of those trains made it all the more likely that something would happen, but it was a miscommunication that caused the head-on. One of them should have been on the siding, letting the other one through. Be that as it may, one of the characters I had basically died of a long-standing bout with shame, having what he felt caused the accident, and had to deal with his perception of what people thought of him in the community, etc. So I had already written draft one of the book with that part of it in it, the man dying of guilt, perceived guilt, real and imagined guilt. And I had been able to be put in touch with a fellow that had photographs of Jim Whyte and his cabin, which I was also able to put in the back of the book, which was incredibly meaningful to me. That's Jim Whyte. I don't know if you can see it, but for those of you who are watching on YouTube, he gave me a number of pictures that I was able to include in the book of Jim Whyte. And those pictures were taken by a relative of his. And when we were getting off the phone call, he said, not too many people know this, but I feel I can share it with you, is that my relative always felt that he was responsible for the Ottawa train wreck. And you guessed it, he basically died of shame. Again, why did I even come up with that plot line or introduce that character? Who knows? Divine intervention, creative intervention, a combination of the two. But it happened, and it happened again and again in the writing of this book. I don't believe in coincidences. I just think that perhaps I was the right person at the right time to write this book and to make the connections that were needed before those connections were also gone from our midst. So that's the story of Jim Whyte and how I fell into writing the book. And I'm so grateful that I was sitting in that office building, toiling away that night. You just never know what's going to happen. Thank you for joining me this week. If you like stories like this and would love to help contribute to more of them making it onto the air, please visit my website, jeffryanauthor.com, where you'll find all of my books. You'll find where you can buy them, obviously descriptions of what you find within them first, but where you can find them both online and in your local bookstore, how you can purchase them. You can also support my work by going to buymeacoffee.com/Jeffrey Ryan, and I'd appreciate if you'd visit one or both. And I look forward to seeing you next week on Tales from the Cabin.